Hello, my name is Jeff Spoonhower. I am one of the co-founders of Resonator, and I'm also doing the art, animation, and sound design for our debut indie game, Anew, the Distant Light. And I'm very excited because with me, I have our amazingly talented composer. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Will Roget. I'm going to be composing all the music for Anew.
Cool. So why don't we start off by talking about sort of how we came together, how I got you involved in the project. There were some early communications, and maybe just talk a little bit about how this, I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but we've talked a little bit about this before about how this is sort of a different type of project as far as how long
Mm.
we've been working together, the amount of time that you've been given to sort of actually think about what you're doing and not being too rushed. Um, so if I remember correctly, the first shot was fired in, I believe it was right around the turn of the year 2015. It was in January of 2015.
Yeah,
Does
yeah,
that
yeah,
sound right?
yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I sent you an email. Steve Copeland, the other half of Resonator, we had been working on the game together for about 5 or 6 months, and we
Mm.
were sort of just coming out of our pre-production phase, and we both agreed we really wanted to do something really special with the music in the game because we knew it would be really important to set the mood of the world. But not only that, but to really sort of tell the story, to help tell the story and set the characters. Um, so I sort of put together my short list of all the composers that I loved. And I'm like, you know what? I have nothing to lose here. I'm just going to email everybody and see what happens, right? And I had just previously before that heard this amazing score to Lara Croft in the Temple of Osiris, and I was just listening to it because IDOS had put it up for free on sound, like they had released the whole score. So I
Yeah.
was listening to it, and I'm like, this is amazing. This is so incredibly well done, so sensitive, like all the themes, and really exciting. So I said, who did this? Like, who did this score? And then that was Will. So I contacted you, and we sort of took it from there. And I sent you some stuff too, right? I sent you some very early
Yeah.
game capture and stuff. So
Yeah, I remember I was very impressed. Number one, because you played the game, and I was like, "Whoa, people actually played this. This is awesome, cool." And also, I got a. It wasn't actually a screenshot. It was actually some short video of the day-night cycle.
right,
And I just remember thinking, I've never seen a game that has exactly that art style. Like, I mean, I think it's fair to say that by that point, the art style was already pretty much, it was pretty well developed,
right,
even 2 years ago. And I saw that, and I basically just thought, well, this could be an opportunity to do something very special in the indie space that you can't really get away with musically, in a AAA game.
right,
Not only musically but also visually and gameplay wise,
right,
and just it seemed like it was really embracing the opportunities that an indie game kind of gives you, where you don't have to please everyone, but you can do something that's so special and unique
right,
that the people who do play it think, oh wow, this is totally awesome.
right. And I mean, I think that's the whole point. That was the whole point for the two of us, for Steve and myself, to even do this in the first place. We'd been working, and I mean, I've been doing games for 15 years. Steve's been doing games for 17
Yeah,
years, and it's like you get to the point where it's like that's the beauty. That's what the risk that we want to take. Those creative risks, right?
exactly.
Make
Yeah.
something that we would want to play. We feel like really invested in. So I was excited when I sent you that stuff, and you wrote back, and you actually wrote back, and I'm like, this is awesome. Will is actually interested. So that was pretty exciting.
What was real funny about that? I remember either on your page or somewhere it talked about the different credits that you and Steve had already worked on. And it turns out we actually worked together, just didn't realize it. I forget even what it was. It
I
was some
believe it
old
was
LucasArts
Fracture.
thing.
Was it
Was it
Fracture?
Fracture, really? Yeah, it was
Yeah,
just a random thing. It was one of my earliest LucasArts titles. And
yeah,
I was like, oh wait, and I think there was another one as well. I mean, it was just so crazy how, like,
yeah,
one of the beautiful things about the AAA world is that when you're around for like long enough, you kind of meet everyone,
mm,
even if you don't even meet them in person. Chances are when you're on a team that has 500 people,
Right.
Names kind of cross, and then I see like, oh, you worked on that one. He knows how hard it is. All right, great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
vetted.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was another important part of our pitch to the composers was, I mean, just sort of leaning on our past experience, right? Between
Mm-hmm.
Steve and myself, we've worked on a lot of games. We've had the good fortune of working on a lot of really good AAA games. So of course we highlighted that in our sort of little resume because we want you to know, because I'm just emailing you totally out. You have no idea who I am, totally out of the blue. We want to at least give the impression that we know what we're doing. What we're doing. Based on what we've worked on in addition to those early visual materials. But so anyway, I believe that's how we sort of kicked it off. And then what came after that was Steve kind of just said, Jeff, go off. You're communicating with these composers. You just start having some conversations with the ones you think would be a good match for the project and for the story and the visuals and this whole sort of world we're trying to create. So that's when we sort of started talking about our musical inspirations and sort of the types of composers we listen to. And I sent you probably more than I needed, but I sent you this big package, right, of tracks from orchestral composers, film stuff. And I said, okay, here you go. Listen to all this stuff, and let's come back in a couple days and let's talk, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I remember it was very unusual. Because normally when I get reference music for a game, what is it? It's other games, it's films, which is fine. It's
Right.
totally fine. But in this case, none of it was film or game music. It was all 20th century art music. And I'm looking at it right now. There's John Adams, Harmony Lair, there's Bela Bartok. There were all kinds of composers. And also some film music that's very left field, like Jerry Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes.
Right.
And I remember thinking, wow, okay, that's a very unusual prospect, but now my interest is completely piqued because how often do you get to write, something like that for a video game? I mean, pretty much never.
Right.
And a lot of it is just on a technical level. It's some things that I really didn't have a chance to do since college.
Right.
But now it's like, okay, well, it's fair game as long as I can figure out a way to make it work with the drama.
Mm-hmm.
And what's always kind of been the uniting factor for all the music in the game, for me personally, was the idea that this is an alien world. It's already populated. They already have their own civilization. They've figured everything out on their own. We are guests to this world, and we don't necessarily understand all of it.
Right.
We don't necessarily know what's going on. Everything is new to us. Not just because the character is basically never lived on any planet, but he born and raised on this ship on the journey to the planet. But also as a player, it's all new to us because we haven't played the game before. But it has its own internal logic. And I just thought that the idea of very challenging 20th century art music as a reference worked perfectly with that because it does have its own internal logic to it. It all makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in a very obvious or commonplace way. So that was sort of what guided me to the sound that we've developed for Anew by now.
And it's funny how you describe that because I think I had never thought of it in those terms, but I think you sort of nailed it. And it's that type of music that I love to listen to. I listen to a lot of Bartok, concerto for orchestra, music for strings, percussion, and Celeste. Those are like two of the big pieces I listened to for a long, long time when I was just letting things happen creatively. When you try to get into that zone and you're just letting things flow, your ideas. That was sort of the soundtrack in my head when I was coming up with the ideas for the world. So that's why I sent you those tracks, because I'm like, that's the mental state that I'm in, and that's the mental state I want to put you in. Yeah. And it's this really weird, it's very dramatic, dissonant, but it's not hard music to listen to. It's actually really beautiful music. And it has like its own really interesting structure, but it kind of moves in and out of unfamiliarity, right?
It does, and what's also what I think also worked incredibly well is that it has, and I don't want to sound too philosophical or whatever, but it has a certain depth to it. Yeah. Like the construction is very important to this type of music. It's not just purely, okay, well, here's the emotion that I'm going for, and then I just kind of go for it. But like, there's a level of complexity in these art music pieces. Because again, these are, some of the greatest composers on earth, that, Bartok, Adams, and they're taking their time to develop their own sort of language so that then they can explore it in much deeper ways than if you were told to, say, score a film in like 2 weeks.
Right.
You wouldn't really have that opportunity. And so getting that as a reference kind of put me, I think, in the correct mindset of, it's worth it to take the time to develop something that's, it's unusual, but I think that's almost ancillary to the fact that it's just its own self-contained kind of world. And then as long as I sort of followed that as a guideline and developed that as much as I could in whatever way that the music sort of took it, pretty much it should hypothetically work for the game, as long as I was very honest about, developing it by its own rules rather than trying to impose more kind of default cinematic sort of elements to it.
And we were never interested. I mean, I was just never interested in anything that sounded. I didn't want it to sound like, The Dark Knight Rises, right? I didn't want it to sound like Gladiator.
Exactly, yeah. Which is not to say that we don't have, action music or emotion or whatever, because we do.
Yeah.
But it just always had to have its own self-contained logic.
Yes, absolutely. So when we started having those conversations, then you got me really. So I got you excited. There's just there's lots of excitement. So I got you excited, and then you came back to me and you're like, yeah, I love that stuff, like this is awesome. So then I got excited because I was thinking, this is really unusual music. So when you sort of responded positively to it, that's when I kind of had the feeling like, I think Will's going to be a really good fit for this. And I heard a lot of that in the stuff that you've done in Lara Croft. There was lots of really complex harmonies and rhythms and stuff. So I think that's kind of what drew me to you in the first place, is I saw some of that stuff already in your music, so I knew I wouldn't have to like pull teeth, Yeah.
Well, the funny story about that, and I won't talk too much about Lara Croft because it's obviously not as relevant, but for that game, we have the Tomb Raider franchise, and it has a crazy long history of amazing composers, but their game is very different from ours. And once Tomb Raider kind of bisected into the reboot franchise, where they're much more documentary style, everything's a little bit slower and more realistic. And then ours, where everything is very helter-skelter, and you can fight, 20 enemies on screen at one time with your 3 friends. So we kind of decided, well, music should change. What can we do to reflect that? And I also noticed that the camera is panned very far back during gameplay. And so what that told me was,
kind of
yeah, exactly. It's much further back. You can see the whole level just from a regular screen. And so what I decided was we would have this much more complicated thing. What I said, it's almost Tomb Raider meets Indiana Jones. So it definitely has that John Williams feel, which I think is where a lot of the sort of 20th century technique came into play with that, was because we couldn't really get away with doing that more. Like, classic Tomb Raider music is very reverent, and it's usually much slower and bigger and broader, huge block chords plus choir plus orchestra, Whereas with ours, everything was so helter-skelter that we had to reflect that somewhat in the music. And so that's where, the more complicated orchestration in the John Williams style came from.
Right. We just had some back and forth conversations to sort of make sure that not only was that a good creative fit, but we could also communicate well together. And that, I think, went well. Good personality match. Because like, this is a very drawn out project, it's just 2 full-time developers, myself and Steve, working on it. So we told you that up front too. It's like, look, Will, we're not going to be able to cut you paychecks, every 2 weeks for 3 months and you'll be done and moving on. So we needed to make sure you're okay with that too. But the one thing that, I'm a film music junkie, right? I love film music. I honestly don't listen to it as much as I used to when I was a little younger, but I always used to read in the liner notes, the composer had 3 weeks to write the score. The composer had 10 days to write this and record it. And it was always my dream to work with someone and be like, you know what? I want to give you all sorts of time to really think about what you're doing. Because so rarely in games anybody work in any facet of games, we rarely have time to actually think about what we're doing, because the timelines are so fast and there's so many deadlines, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. So I was just excited to tell you, like, look, I want you to really think about this and give it a lot of thought, because I want you to do, we're trying to do something special. I want you to do something special that you're going to be really proud of with the music.
Yeah. And the thing about that is when you're given, and this is just a window into how film and game composers tend to work. Mm-hmm. When you're given a very short deadline, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality will go down at all, really. It just means that you have less time to develop something that's very unique. You have to kind of rely more on what you've already written, or what like more established ideas are, and you just kind of you fall back to that. Hopefully, you'll match the drama of the scene and of the game or whatever you're working on.
Right.
And there can still be little time for revision, but hopefully that's not going to happen if you only have 2 weeks to score it.
Right.
But you kind of do a lot of falling back and relying on other people's answers or your previous answers to questions. But when you're given a long period of time, you kind of have the space to ask new questions, to have unique answers to old questions, to approach things in different ways that you wouldn't have thought of.
Right.
If you only had a short period of time. Also, a lot of times when you're given a tight deadline, you know for a fact that you want to do things this way, but you have to kind of think, well, all right, I could do that if I had the time to do it, but I just don't.
Right.
So instead, you kind of compromise. You go with something that's a little easier and simpler. Sometimes that's actually a very good thing because you come up with something clever and unique that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a compromise, and it does, to some degree, lessen the idea of like having a creative vision that you've brought to the project and done something that that really conveys how you feel as an artist.
Right. And do you feel like, and now just so folks understand, you are a freelance composer, so you're working on all sorts of stuff all the time. So you'll sort of, I'll say, hey, we're working on this new part of the game. Can you, and we'll get into work into the way we work together in just a minute. But my point is that you're kind of weaving in and out of different projects. So you'll come back to us after a month or two of working on something else. Do you have new perspectives on what you're doing? Like, is your mind allow itself to sort of reflect a little bit by having those breaks, or what do you think about that? To be
perfectly honest, I feel like I've been incredibly lucky just in the fact that every soundtrack that I've done feels different to me personally. Maybe someone else would listen to it and it's like, oh, it's just that Will Roget crap that he does all the time. But to me, they all feel very different, and I feel very lucky that I've been able to score projects where I could take a different direction each time.
Right.
So when I come back to at this point, when I come back to Anew, it's almost like I just kind of I'm looking at my project file right now, and it's I'm like almost an hour in, so I kind of have a sense of, okay, this is what Anew sounds like. Mm-hmm. And it's never terribly difficult for me to switch gears and go back to that. But I would say that as I do a soundtrack or even an individual piece, maybe I'll come up with some technique or some sound that I'm just like, oh, you know what, something like that might work in this game or in the other or whatever.
Right.
Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. But you always learn something from other experiences.
That's great. So I want to talk next about the style, not really the orchestration or the instrumentation of the music, but sort of the use of themes that we're going to be taking in the game, right? And I don't want to talk too much about what those themes are attached to because I don't want to spoil anything yet. But that was one thing that I sort of expressed to you early on is like, there's different ways of writing music. We have that more sort of mood music, that sort of textural stuff where it's just sort of a sound that makes you feel something. And then we have the more traditional way of scoring using themes, and these themes are attached to characters or times or places. And that's what I sort of said to you is like, look, I want to do themes. I want to like have themes that when they play, even if you've twisted them or modified them, it's gonna pull some sort of emotional response from the player. Yeah. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those early conversations too, and how you're using that. now?
Yeah, I mean, well, what I will say, and I hope this doesn't spoil things too much, but the very first thing that I thought of for this project, which might not have been the first thing I showed you, but it was definitely the first thing that came to mind, was I wanted a theme for this alien world itself.
Hmm.
And as the project developed, it's become something a little different than that, a little bit more nuanced, especially with us developing the story further.
Right.
But the first thing I said was, I want something that's almost the exact opposite of what you would expect for a main theme for something.
Mm.
So if you look at Star Wars, and this is going to get a little music theory, whatever, but the very first two notes you hear of the Star Wars theme are what's called the perfect fifth. So that's where you're ba ba. It's that fifth,
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a iconic interval. It's fanfare for the common man. It's
Mm-hmm.
whenever you want to do heroism in a film score, game score, in a symphony, whatever, you use that interval, usually on like French horn or something,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just this big brassy heroic thing. And I was like, what would be the exact opposite of that? And it almost immediately came to me. The very first, and this is the most important interval in the entire soundtrack. It's a descending, what's called tritone, which is an augmented fourth, if you will, the devil's interval, as they sometimes called it back in the day. And I swear, this is the very first thing I thought of. I said, okay, instead of a horn playing a rising perfect fifth, let's have a flute in its weakest, lowest register where you can barely hear it, and steel drums doubling it,
Yeah. Yeah.
playing a descending tritone. Boom, boom. And where do you go from there? And that's literally the entire Alien theme.
That's really cool.
Everything revolves around that, and
Yeah.
it's an entire melody. And hopefully by the end of the game, players can like recognize it, hum it, whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and nobody's heard this. I've heard it, and I
yeah,
always get
yeah. Well,
excited because you bring
it's
that
actually
theme back
yeah,
with different instruments in different contexts, and it's just so exciting to hear it. And it's like that's exactly what I wanted when I was first
yeah, yeah.
imagining this. Is like it's there, and you may not. It's not like ET Elliot with ET flying in front of the moon, like in your face, but it is there, and it's there for people to take, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's something that because of the harmonic language that we've developed for Anew, I can work it in a lot of different places. It's actually in the reason I was okay with mentioning this was it is in that boss theme that we've
Yeah.
uploaded to SoundCloud, Angel Order. Um, Towards the end with the horn or the trumpets and the horns just blasting crazy quintuplets over the whole orchestra. Um, but yeah, I mean, it can work its way in. What I love about writing melodically like this and thematically with these leitmotifs is that you can almost create like a dialogue with the player if they're clever enough to listen, where you can give them hints about, well, this is, because we're a game that doesn't have much in the way of like text or dialogue. It's
Which
it's
is
all about
intentional.
environment. Yeah, exactly. It's
So,
all about environmental storytelling. And so I
right.
figured, okay, I have an opportunity to tell a little bit of backstory on each scene if I just use these themes correctly and
Right.
if I'm just very careful about what I use when.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we've got three or four themes that we're drawing
Mm.
from, and I think we're good. I don't I don't know if I'm going to ask you to make any more. I think because
Oh,
if you
there's
get
actually there's actually more than that. You just don't know it
LC, I'm learning
yet.
something myself.
Yeah, actually, isn't that funny? I actually don't think I ever tell you, hey, this is like the this faction's theme or the these things
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not.
yeah.
I kind of like working that way because if it works, then great, and if not, then whatever. I kind of feel like a second director, kind of like adding a little bit of extra meaning to the
Oh
to the
yeah,
scenes with that.
and it
Yeah.
works. I mean, I know it works, and I know people are gonna get excited about it when they hear it. And I know just with our trailer, we get so many comments from people saying the music's so great, it just
Oh,
feels so right. So I think we're heading in the right direction.
that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe next we can just talk a little bit about how we work together, right?
Sure.
So how do you act? So where does this music come from? How do I request music? How do you give me stuff to listen to?
Yeah.
Typically, the way we work is, uh, you know, if we're working on a new zone or a new section in the game, each area in the game, each part of the world has a very unique visual identity, has a very unique look and feel. So what I usually do is I'll say, hey, Will, we're working on this section. Again, I'll send you one or two reference tracks. This is just tonally what I think could work. And I hope I never like am dictating to you, like, do that. I try to just give you things to think about, really, is what I like to do.
Yeah,
Please tell me if I ever come up.
Well, what ends up happening is I don't usually, and this is something that I think every composer learns eventually. Mm-hmm. When you get reference tracks, it doesn't necessarily mean make it sound like this, but instead it's up to you to figure out why they chose those particular ones, which is actually why I love it when we get contrasting reference tracks. So then it's like easier for me to pick out, like, well, what do these have in common? Mm-hmm. Or, is there something about what I'm seeing on screen that makes sense with both of these? And then you're able to dissect and come up with your own thing.
Right.
And I think that usually the way it works is, I get the reference tracks and those are great, but what usually helps me the most is when I see video of the new areas or screenshots. But for me, video actually works even better. And I can kind of see that, and usually some idea will pop in my head. It's usually crazy, and so I'm just like, all right, well, I'm not going to bother making that normal. Let's just see where we go with this.
And I prefer that you go with that initial reaction.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a bad idea. Actually, frequently it's a bad idea. So I only send over the stuff that I think is worthwhile. But usually once I get that, I'll either just write ideas down freeform on just in text. By the way, that's my new thing. I use notepad.exe for writing music now, believe it or not.
Why not?
Everything starts with just a series of words, phrases, ideas. Sometimes it's concrete things like, use Col Legno, violins or something like that. Sometimes it's more broad, like, okay, this should sound, airy and whispery and the color gray and a little bit of blue, things that can just sort of guide. And then once I have enough ideas there, then I go to the sketching stage where, I write everything on paper. I sketch out on paper, notation and all that. Mm-hmm. And, I'll write things down. Again, sometimes it's really stupid and I'm just like, all right, well, whatever. But I like to get all the stupid ideas out of the way so that then eventually something that's usable comes up. And only at that point do I finally say, all right, now we can move into the computer, do the whole sequencing thing, come up with a mock-up, kind of compose things out a little bit, and then show you maybe a work in progress. How is this? Is this the right vibe or whatever? Mm-hmm. What's nice about working to screenshots or visuals is that I can just have it right there, and I can just be like, okay, well, I'll hit play. Does it work with this? Does it feel quite right? If I were, I'm imagining myself playing, and it's like, does this feel like something I would experience as a player? And if it does, then it's like, great, pass the test. We'll see what happens, send it off.
Right. And I wish that we could give you more of that stuff. I usually give you visual reference as soon as I possibly can. Mm-hmm. And a lot of time there's just not a lot of it because it's, again, small team, right? So as soon as I get a little nugget of something I can give you that will hopefully inspire something, that's when I send it to you.
And sometimes even still images. One of the most iconic things about the art in this game, I think, is the way that it deals with the triangle. If you look at Earth civilization, everything for us is all about squares.
Right.
We're big on squares, at least in the modern era. I mean, obviously we had the pyramids, Egypt, whatever. But a lot of our structure is square-based, whereas a lot of what I'm seeing in Anew is triangle-based and fractal-based. Mm-hmm. You see this in the monsters as well, in some of the creatures. And I thought, okay, that's a very interesting approach. What can I do with that musically that perhaps is something that we haven't seen before? And it doesn't actually even have to be literal, because if it's something visually that we haven't really seen before, mm-hmm. then whatever, my job is easy, because whatever I come up with, people will just think, oh yeah, that corresponds with that, when in reality it's just a very vague, impressionistic reading of what I'm seeing.
But as long as it all works together, I think it's fine.
Yeah,
as long as it feels right.
Yeah.
So the one really great thing about getting those, what we called sort of concept pieces from you, is that they really inspired they inspired Steve and me a lot in our work. So the great thing is that I like to send you things that hopefully inspire you to come up with musical ideas. You send the ideas back to me, and they're usually way better than I would have ever hoped for. So anytime you send me music back, it's like a great day. I get so excited.
Oh, it's awesome.
I pull my kids into my office, my wife. I'm like, oh my God, you guys got to hear this. It's like so awesome. But
wow, the kids are listening to this crazy, nasty atonal music.
Yeah. They're very closely following how this process works.
Nice.
But anyway, the music that you're writing for the game is actually informing what we are doing in the world and with the story and with everything. So like, it's not just you're plugging music in to fit into the game, into this, to set the mood. Your music is actually informing us and helping us to make decisions about what feels amazing and like mysterious and beautiful in the world. So I don't know if I've ever told you that, Will, but I wanted to let you know publicly that.
That's cool. Like the thing, I think one of the reasons why that works is the way that I like to approach game soundtracks, especially at the beginning. I don't really start by saying, okay, here's like level 1's theme, and here's this loop, and here's, whatever.
Here's Bubble Man, here's Airman.
Yeah, what I like to do is start with extremely vague sketches that have don't necessarily have any kind of like place in the game. It's just trying to get the vibe right, trying to get the imagery, how I connect between visual and music on a more broad sense. And then from there, once I've done enough of that, then I feel comfortable doing like, okay, well, here's this like in-game loop or boss name or whatever.
Right.
But I remember, I believe like the intro to the game is one of the first things that I actually showed you. And
the cinematic, the opening cinematic.
Yeah, like the intro movie or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just had this, I don't even remember hearing that you were, like, I actually don't remember you telling me that there would be an intro cinematic or there would be any kind of like a lift off or landing or anything like that. I just kind of thought like, well, if you're coming to this planet, you have to get there somehow. So here's an idea. And it just kind of came to me. It's just an idea for how something like that could hypothetically sound. And I wrote it out. And then I got back. You had done the cutscene. And then I was like, oh, great. So this is almost, and then I kind of edited things a little bit to work with the timing and whatnot.
Yeah, you basically just wrote an orchestral piece with no no parameters. I just said, it's just sort of what you envisioned in your mind, and you sent it back. And I'm like, holy cow, this is, wow, okay. And I was sort of in the early stages of planning out the cinematic, but I ended up actually creating and cutting a great deal of the cinematic to your music. Right? So you sent it to me, and then you just did some very minor timing edits to it. Yeah. So it was almost the reverse of how things usually work, because usually you get a cinematic and it's like, okay, here's how we score this. But in this case, it was much more impressionistic. It was much more like, okay, well, I think that we'll need something like this, and so I kind of just wrote it freeform and let the music take whatever direction that it wanted to, and then. From there, then I guess you did have in mind some sort of a cinematic for showing, the setup,
the intro to the game, but it kind of just sort of happy coincidence. It all kind of fit together.
Yeah, but I love that, and that's something else I really wanted to do on a very personal level as an artist on this game, was to just really loosen up and not overthink everything, because I feel like. Yeah. When you're on a big team and a big game, everything is being nitpicked. You have multiple tiers of art directors and management. Everything's, move that pixel to the left, do this, do that. So for me, is like when I'm designing and thinking about the world and the characters, I try to just draw and sketch as quickly as I can to get as many ideas down as quickly as I can. And one of my little secrets that I did was to come up with just some of the weird things was as I was falling asleep at night, I would put the sketchbook in front of me with my pen, and literally as I was falling asleep, I would just start drawing. Oh wow! Because I didn't really actually want to think. I wanted the stuff to look weird. And when you're thinking rationally and consciously about everything all the time, your work tends to look. You start imposing rules on yourself. Yeah. So that's what I'm excited about. And when you started sending that music, I'm like, that's totally working with this weird stuff that I'm thinking about. So I want to encourage you to keep being loose.
Oh, that's crazy.
All
Yeah.
right?
What I love about that is that, the subconscious mind does have its own logic, but it's exactly like what we're creating, where it's like it has its own logic, but we don't have access to it. So to us, on one level, it just seems like, oh, this weird, so strange, but it has its own internal, gears
Right.
that are churning from your past experiences, from, what you've seen and all
Right.
that.
Yeah, and how do you
So
make
wow, that's
something feel
cool.
like a dream, Like how do you make it
Yeah.
feel weird?
Well, actually, one of my compositional techniques is that when I'll have some idea like wherever, and then maybe I'll actually start jotting things down a little bit. But I have a second notepad just right on my bed, and so I'll actually just go take a nap. And then when you're in that sort of alpha brainwave state, for whatever reason, you can actually just compute certain things way faster than you could consciously.
Right.
So I'll run through like this is actually how I compose melodies. I'll just run through almost every permutation of like what intervals to use, what rhythm, whatever, and just keep going through it again and again and again, just hundreds of times until finally it's like, okay, this is something that sticks. This
And
is
this
what
is
clicks.
just in your head.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
mentally, but I
Right,
mean,
right.
when you're in that sort of subconscious,
Yeah.
alpha wave, whatever state, as long as you have control over the situation, then yeah, you can roll through it way faster than you could if I were like sitting at a keyboard or whatever.
Yep, yep. Yeah, and it's all about trying to do something different and unique. That's for me is
Yeah.
the highest of high level goals for this whole project is like even if there's familiar things with gameplay or with the way you jump or the way you shoot or the way whatever, I want it to look and feel and sound unique, and I really hope at the end of the day, whenever we actually finish this game, that we will accomplish that.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
You
And
know?
what's nice and what I loved about it when I tested it out, I think at E3 or when we got together,
Yeah.
was that the things that you want to be standardized or whatever as a player were already there. I thought it controlled great. It felt
Mm.
really good to move around. Animation was working, perfectly fine. I was just like, yeah, this feels cool. But then everything around that was spectacularly weird and was like, wait, well, how do I? Okay,
Right.
this monster, I didn't even realize that was a monster. Okay, I'm
Right.
dead now. But that's what I liked is that I think that players will appreciate that the core mechanics are still very solid.
Right.
But we just made sure that we're giving them a reward for going through that as well.
Right. Absolutely. So you're writing music all the time. What do you listen to when you're not making your own? Like, what do you listen to that helps keep you motivated and inspired on a day-to-day basis? Do you actually listen to music?
So my phone is on like just a ridiculous, like a grand shuffle of like everything.
Okay.
I don't really listen to. I do listen to soundtracks. They work their way into the shuffle, but you'll see all kinds of like artists you never would have thought that I would be into. There's like bluegrass in there. There's Erykah Badu. There's lots of Japanese anime and J-pop, which is that's another one of my passions.
Mm-hmm.
I I was so tuned into the whole I'm going to do video game music thing as a high schooler and middle schooler that I kind of missed out on 90s alt rock. But now I'm like rediscovering it as an adult, and I'm like, "Whoa, this Nirvana band is great!" Like, I
That's
wonder
so
what happened
funny.
to the. Oh, yeah,
That's really funny that you mentioned that because I've been listening to a ton of 90s music, and I don't
yeah,
know if it's because because making games is so hard and stressful that I'm trying to like fall back on something that makes me feel comfortable,
Hmm.
like Dave Matthews and
yeah,
lots of Oasis, and I've been listening to a ton of Genesis and Rush, like
yeah, yeah,
early 80s Rush.
yeah.
It just makes me feel good. Is like I'm trying to like get the right chemicals going,
Yeah, and most of when I'm listening to music, it's like if I'm outside, like traveling to wherever on the
Right.
bus or at the gym or something like that. And
Right.
so I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, I need to do like research. But another one of my compositional tricks or techniques or whatever, I use a software called Trello, which is sort of like how would you describe like
Yeah,
a
that's what we're using.
productivity management thing?
Yep, that's what we
But I
use
had, yeah,
to
yeah.
manage it. Yeah.
But I have a Trello workspace or whatever for all of my projects.
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's tasks, but oftentimes it's actually just ideas. Again, that sort of notepad.exe
Right.
idea thing. And, I might be listening to some like terrible rock. I might be listening to like I don't know, like Tokyo Hotel or like Nickelback or something. But I'll hear something in there that I'm like, oh, this actually could be useful for like this project or for that thing or
Right,
for that
right.
level or whatever. And I'll put the reference in. I'll say like, hey, look at this harmonic shift, in like verse 2 or whatever of this song,
Yep.
timestamp it. Um, so that's why I don't really listen to albums like start to finish. That's
Mm,
not to me that's not fun. I just do the whole grand shuffle of everything.
right.
I like to surprise myself with
Keep
what
yourself on
comes
your
on
toes,
next.
right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then it's like maybe I'll hear something that I can actually use, and I'm like, oh, this is cool.
Cool. And let yourself be surprised. Like don't plan it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not. I don't go to the gym with the ulterior motive of like getting some idea for a game or whatever. But it's just
Right.
I might hear something, and I have Trello right on my phone, so it's just like, oh yeah,
Nice.
think about that.
Yeah, you got your workflow. All right, so why don't we take a few minutes and I'm going to flip it over to you. And why don't we take a look at some things that you've been working on in the game? So we'll open up one of the tracks and I'll throw it over to you, Will, and you can kind of explain to folks how you do your work and show us some cool stuff. How does that sound?
Sure. Yeah.
I thought it would be kind of cool to show you how I kind of put stuff together. Jeff gave me permission to show a little bit of the intro cinematic music. We haven't really shown this before, but in the intro, what happens is it's sort of like a takeoff from a near destroyed Earth. So you'll hear this kind of big, lengthy crescendo, and then you go into space, and what we're seeing is the protagonist starting off as a baby, and then in sort of like a series of cuts, you see that the baby is actually growing into an adolescent as the lengthy, I think, journey to the new alien world takes place. So I'll play this for you. Tonally, what you'll hear is it's going to start off by sort of setting up the mystery. You're going to hear a lot of desperation and a lot of energy when we're still on Earth, still launching into space. But once we get out into space, that's when a lot of the what I would call alien sound kind of begins. But interspersed with that, you also hear quite a lot of innocence because again, this is the protagonist, and he's still a baby, he doesn't know anything about what's going on, and you'll hear that it's still harmonically human, even though the sound is drastically different. It's no longer all about acoustic sound. So here's this piece. So the way that this piece works is that initially you hear that giant crescendo, and what that's all about is I just said to myself, okay, I'm going to take one interval, which is the perfect fourth, and I'll just kind of keep building on that more and more and more as time goes on. So you'll see that in the brass. What I've done was I started off with trombones holding sort of a stacked fourths harmony, meaning that it's just a bunch of different fourth intervals all stacked on top of each other, as you can see here. And then from that, it just kind of keeps getting louder and louder and louder, as you see here. with more detail, more energy. The strings come in and they kind of do their thing, and then it just kind of gets bigger and bigger until we have that that moment where all of the sound just kind of goes away. And the way that I conceive of these types of, I guess, gestures, orchestral gestures, is that I sketch everything on paper before I do anything else, so that I can have a good sense of the piece as a whole. And then once I have a good idea of, okay, this is how I want it to be, then I'll finally come into the sequencer here. I use a program called Reaper for all of my music production. And I also use a program called Contact, which is where all of the instruments live, where all of the sounds come from. That and another one called Play. And basically I'll play in on my computer, on my synthesizer keyboard, I'll play in all of the lines, almost like I'm performing them. So, you know, you would hear things like, you know, I'm playing this live right now, but and that's all me, you know, on a keyboard, kind of playing it and recording it. And I just do that literally hundreds of times and edit the recordings, and eventually it sounds almost kind of like a bunch of live orchestral musicians have played it. Obviously not quite as good, but that's how I've been able to make these pieces. And yeah, I mean, you know, once I kind of have all of the orchestration written out, I'll make sure to listen to everything, make sure everything is kind of in balance. You know, everyone kind of has their different strategies towards mixing and production. I'm very traditionalist, so once I've kind of done everything in the box, I just sort of let it go. I just say, all right, I'm not going to do any kind of compression or any fancy production techniques. I just kind of leave it as is to preserve the sound of the orchestra and be as sort of legit as possible. But what's unique about this score, and you kind of hear this as the piece goes along, is that it uses both orchestral elements and synthesizer elements together in sort of like a cohesive whole. Like, not one is really dominating, and especially once you get to the alien world, the synthesizer kind of takes over quite a lot of what the orchestral palette usually would be. One example of it that you did actually hear here was this piano. It's actually 4 different piano sounds all in one. So I have this, which I think is a normal piano, but I've added a bunch of like phaser and compression and weird, you know, effects to it to get, you know, the kind of harmony that you hear in the background. And then on top of that, I have another piano sound from a program called Omnisphere. That I've kind of edited to make it sound a little bit more like a steel drum, which later on becomes a very important sound in this score, the steel drum. And then I just kind of put them together, and I did a lot with effects to kind of make a warbly, pulsing, weird sound on top of that. For example, I have a pad that's made from scraping bamboo against the floor, and I have a bunch of metallic sounds that actually are taking a flexitone, which is sort of like a metal instrument, and kind of bowing it. And then I've done a bunch of processing to that as well. And then I also have a lot of extended techniques of the double bass that I use, and just you know, it's as many just weird things as I could come up with. I kind of threw it all in there to get that sort of spacey sound. And yeah, so that's kind of how I put all this together. Yeah, so in a project like Anew, I'm using a full orchestra and synthesizers and a bunch of different effects and whatnot. And as you can see, that means kind of a ridiculous number of tracks. And as if that weren't bad enough, and this is my own weird thing that not a lot of people do, I actually put the entire soundtrack in one file. So as you're seeing here, and I'm only about half done, but it goes about an hour in, and as you can imagine, that creates a little bit of an organizational nightmare. But the way that I mitigate that was, first of all, I have what's called track folders. And what this lets me do is I can actually organize everything as you would see it on an orchestral score written out. So, for example, I have the woodwinds are all up at the top, and then brass, and then percussion, and then eventually strings at the bottom. And this lets me very easily find whatever it is that I need to be working on. You'll also see that I have regions. This is a feature that Reaper gives me, so I can see, okay, well, this region is the intro, and that region is, different versions of things. Here's the landing piece and all that. So that lets me just quickly go from one piece to another. The reason that I do everything in one project file is because I like to be able to easily take things from one cue, one piece of music to another. So for example, maybe I've recorded some cool percussion thing on this cue, and then I want to bring that back on something else. Well, I can just drag it right over without any issue. And plus, it also lets me just get started very quickly. The mix is already there and it's very consistent, so I don't have to think about, oh, are strings too loud in this cue, or anything like that. Everything is already mixed and ready to go, so I can just start writing. And the nice thing about Reaper is that I have, again, these folders, and that lets me easily say, okay, well, I want my strings to maybe have some effect, so I have this EQ here so that I can get them a little darker, or maybe I want at some point for the percussion to be a little louder, so I can have these envelopes which let me adjust the volume anywhere. And it's just a nice organizational tool. Like, as you can see here, I've minimized these tracks, so if I'm only working on, say, brass, I can expand that, and here I am working, and then when I'm finished with that, I can minimize it again. So it's just sort of a nice workflow thing that helps me find everything. I'm not going to say that Anew is the densest project I've ever worked on, but it's pretty close. And the fact that we're only halfway through absolutely terrifies me, because we're already at an absurd amount of RAM and CPU use. But we'll get there when we get there. But it's a lot of different sounds, a lot of different sound sources that we work with, just because of the nature of the music direction that we've chosen. So it's always nice to have some organizational tool to make sure that everything is where it needs to be, and I'm not wasting a bunch of time looking for things, or wasting CPU and RAM by having too much open at once. So yeah, that's how I basically put everything together in my program, Reaper. And this is just sort of a window into my organization and all that. And I hope you enjoyed taking a look into how the meat is made.